Hello, welcome to part 2 of the audio lecture on Post-Impressionism and the Rise of Modernism. We ended the first half of the lecture discussing Paul Cézanne, the father of modern art. So let's begin by continuing our discussion of this important artist. Here we have two examples of a portrait of the same man. On the right is a portrait of Renoir, and on the left it's by Cézanne. And you can see, okay, the right looks a lot more real. But the artist on the left is really experimenting with color, with brushstrokes, and there's an energy and a movement there that's different, not necessarily inferior, but definitely moving away from the realism that many people associate with a, quote, good work of art. So, in his time, Cézanne, he had a tough time. He was kind of, let's see, he had an insecurity complex, shall we say. In fact, this guy had a woman that he lived with, and his son was 11 years old before his father even knew about it. And his father was actually supporting Cézanne. So he was kind of a troubled man in his life. But he was really a genius as an artist. He believed that all things could be broken down to simple elements, that art was a vehicle to express these elements in a variety of settings. He had a sort of objective, non-emotional approach to painting. In his work, we see a further flattening of forms and a move away from the rules of perspective that were started in the Renaissance. Look at this still life on the left. You know what? There is not really perspective happening there. It's just kind of painted. But it's a very interesting and a beautiful painting all the same. So he also painted repeated views of the same mountains in the French countryside. Same thing. He ignored the details and he broke the landscape down into these simple patches of color. After he was harshly reviewed by critics in these impressionist shows, Cézanne became disillusioned and he left Paris, retreating into the French countryside. And this is where he created works that are now considered to be masterpieces. Through Cézanne's ability to reduce nature to simple shapes, and by his insistence that art does not have to accurately represent the subject, Cézanne laid the groundwork for the modern art movement of the 20th century. By the time he finally achieved wide recognition for his art, in the last 10 years of his life, he really seemed not to notice. By this time, he was so dedicated to his art, maybe he didn't care so much. He continued to follow this vision until he died in 1906 at the age of 67. Now, Auguste Rodin, he's another guy who, if you look at his art now, it's interesting. Do we consider that radical and revolutionary? Probably not. At the time, yes, it was. He was had a life really of a lot of struggle. He had studied classical sculpture, but he was driven to create these more expressive kind of works. The one that's on the left really strikes me. It's called The Old Courtesan. So that's a woman who has given her life to being beautiful, and now she's old. Her aging body no longer fulfills that purpose, and she just looks so sad. Now the one on the right, I want you to really look at this detail. It's from a sculpture called The Burghers of Calais. We'll look at it more in the next slide, but notice the emotion on the face of this guy. So this, oh my gosh, this was such a hassle for him to complete because it was nothing like the town fathers of the town of Calais had in mind. So this piece is actually based on a historic event where the elders of the town of Calais chose to sacrifice their lives in order to save the lives of the townspeople. The townspeople were under siege, and these guys, all the leaders, said, okay, you can kill us, but save our people. So it took Rodin 10 years to convince the people of Calais to accept this piece. Why? Well, instead of a classic Greek-style sculpture that depicted the heroes in idealized form, this sculpture shows humans in various stages of internal struggle, anger, and surrender. Rodin intended for this piece to be displayed at ground level as shown, but it was originally placed on a pedestal, which he didn't like at all. I mean, in sculpture, you really have to know where the viewer will be, and that's how you create the sculpture to best effect. After Rodin's death, the sculpture was taken off the pedestal and returned to a more accessible view. I've seen the Burgers of Calais. There's several versions of it, and it's just a very powerful, powerful sculpture. Henri Matisse is best known for his experiments with color. And really, what I want you to see here is just notice how the shadows are painted on the right, which is actually a picture of Matisse by his friend, André Derain. And then I want you to know something about the artist. Okay, on the left, it's a very famous painting called The Green Stripe. I wonder why it got that name. Eh? Well, this artist was part of a group who called themselves the Fauvists. And Fauvist means wild beast. So these guys were all wild beasts of color. And we'll see in the next slide how far they took that to an extreme. What I want you to see here is that here is this guy. He's in his 80s and he can no longer walk. He uses a wheelchair. What's he doing? He's making a clay sculpture in his bed. I find that to be quite honorable myself. All right, so we've been looking, like with the whole Renaissance era and even with the Impressionists, a strong emphasis on light and shadow. The academic artists made great use of this. On the other hand, the Fauvists focused on strong contrasts of color. You still see light and shade, but it's created, the image of light and shade, the illusion, is created with color rather than just with making one color darker. This is a painting by André Derain, and it's in a real classic Fauvist work. He's used these blocks and sploofs of color to create these forms, moving ever further from realism. Okay, now we're going to look at one that I bet most of you have seen. And I want you to get this vocabulary word from looking at this particular painting. The word is expressionism. It's totally easy to remember because you think about express, expressing emotions. Expressionism means emotional art. All right? So these are paintings that express strong emotions or that have a strong emotional content. Here's one of the most famous ones, called The Scream by the Norwegian artist named Edvard Munch. This artist had a very difficult life, and we see this expressed in his work. This piece was painted in 1893, before World War I. But he was in Europe, and the troubles that would lead to World War I, they were brewing. And also, this particular artist struggled with illness, with tuberculosis. And I believe his sister had just died of tuberculosis, and his mother was ill. So what he says in writing about painting The Scream is that he was walking along the fjord. Think about Norway, cold, gray, windy, foggy, okay? He's walking with two friends, and all of a sudden he's overcome by this feeling of such despair that he went home and he painted this painting. He actually painted 5 of them. You can even see his 2 friends off in the distance. Another expressionist artist that is exemplary of this style is the artist Kathy Kolowitz. She worked almost entirely in black and white, and her work has this sad and somber feel. Now this artist's story is sort of similar to Munch's, except for that she lived through World War I and World War II. And many of the men in her life were killed in the war or in the influenza epidemic. She did lose her grandson, her husband, and her father to war. So as a result, she created these sad paintings, which she simply kept creating throughout her life. I love the drawing on the right because she did not have to scribble like that on her arm, but in so doing, you see the vibrancy, you see that the arm is in motion, that it's a drawing in process. So now, last and certainly not least, let's discuss photography. Photography was invented in 1835 by a man named Louis Daguerre. Upon creating one of his early images, he exclaimed, "I have seen the light, I have arrested its flight." His first image was known as a daguerreotype, and it's pictured above left. In this early photograph, he's chosen to create a still life that's very similar to what artists were painting at that time. He seems to have had the idea of photography as an art form, even at the earliest stage. The photo below is from 1843 by William Talbot, and it shows the next stage as photography continued to develop. Here he used a process involving a negative so that several prints could actually be made from a single photograph. The rise of photography could have helped to prompt the trend away from realism in art. In fact, it's widely believed that this did have a strong influence because artists no longer had to reproduce people realistically, say for a portrait. You could do that with photograph. Now, it also gave photographers the means to document daily life in a way that was more realistic and immediate than anything that had come before. And this gave rise to great social change. There was a photographer, there's several of these photographers that I love. Eugene Smith, Lewis Hines, Dorothea Lange. But let's talk about Lewis Hines here. He worked in the early 1900s and took photos of the poverty and slums in the big cities of this country. And his work had such an influence that it helped Congress it helped to influence Congress to enable the Child Labor Act and other assistance to the poor. When we look at this picture on the left, she's a little girl and she's in a cotton mill. So these are the kind of pictures that he took that really helped to create, change the laws basically, and to protect children. Now, photography has proven throughout its history to be a powerful medium to capture moments in time and to preserve them for use by future generations. We can either enjoy them, draw from them from a historic perspective, or as in this case, use them to create change. Also, with photography, in some ways, it's a way to get a sense of our timelessness, as we see how much the people of 100 years ago resemble the people of today. And let's end this segment just to talk about photographs that depict pure joy. And isn't that a beautiful thing to get, whether it's from an image, for a walk outside, for completing your Goldsworthy project, or for whatever it is that brings you joy in your life. This concludes the audio lecture on post-impressionism, and as always, I gotta say, hey, thanks for listening.